The warning was already dying on Ida Cooper's lips when Emmett Ellsworth turned around and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she understood with a cold, terrible certainty that she had made a catastrophic mistake in coming here. "You need to leave Harrow Creek," she said, because she had ridden 3 days to say exactly that, because a man named Victor Crane had paid her $10 to deliver those words and not one syllable more. "Leave tonight. Do not wait for morning." Emmett did not move. He stood in the doorway of his ranch house with a lantern in one hand and a letter she recognized in the other, and the letter was the thing that stopped her cold. It was the letter she had carried in her coat for the first leg of her journey, the letter from Crane's associate in Tucson, the letter she had read in a moment of desperate curiosity one night beside a dying campfire and then resealed with trembling hands. The letter she had believed she'd hidden from everyone. He held it up slowly, and the lantern light made the paper glow amber between his fingers. "This yours?" he asked. The night air smelled of juniper and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness behind her a coyote called once and then went silent. Ida felt the careful architecture of her deception collapse in a single, breathless second. She had been sent here as a messenger. She had been sent here as bait, and Emmett Ellsworth, a man she had never met before this moment, was looking at her like he had been waiting for exactly this. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Found it under your saddle blanket when I put your horse in the stable," he said. "Your horse needed water. You looked like you needed a minute to collect yourself." He tilted his head. "You've been reading other people's mail, Miss Cooper." The way he said her name made her blood go cold, because she had not told him her name. She took one step backward toward the porch steps, calculating the distance to the stable, calculating whether a woman alone could outride whatever trap had just snapped shut around her. And that was the moment she realized with absolute, bone-deep certainty that she had never been in control of any of this. "Sit down," Emmett said, and his voice was not unkind. "I'm not going to hurt you. But you need to hear what I'm about to tell you, and after you hear it, you're going to want to make a different choice than the one you came here to make." She sat down because she had no good reason not to, and because the alternative was riding alone into a Texas night in 1883 with no idea who was waiting on the road behind her. And that was how the whole terrible, impossible, world-altering story truly began. Ida Cooper had not always been the kind of woman who could be hired to carry a warning across 3 counties. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she had been a schoolteacher in a town called Millbridge, 30 miles east of San Antonio, with a small house and a garden of kitchen herbs and a reputation for being sensible. The sensible life had lasted until the winter of 1882, when her father's debts caught up with the family in the form of a man named Victor Crane. Victor Crane was not the worst man in Texas, but he was methodical in a way that was somehow more frightening than raw cruelty. He was 43 years old, lean and patient, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades learning exactly how much pressure to apply to any given situation. He had bought her father's debts from 3 different creditors, assembled them into a single instrument of obligation, and arrived at Millbridge in November with the papers in a leather satchel and a very specific proposal. The proposal was this: Ida would serve as one of his couriers. She would carry messages, documents, and occasionally small parcels to various locations across the region. She would ask no questions. She would deliver exactly what she was given. In return, her father's debts would be retired at a rate of $1 per errand completed, and the family would keep the land. She had agreed because there was no other agreement to make. For 7 months she had carried letters and parcels, and once, memorably, a sealed tin box that clattered faintly when she rode over rough terrain, and she had told herself the sensible thing, which was that she did not know what any of it contained, and therefore she was not responsible for any of it. She had ridden alone across summer prairie and through late spring thunderstorms, and once in the company of 2 of Crane's men who had ridden silently at her flanks and never spoken directly to her, and she had delivered every item to every destination without incident or inquiry. Until the letter from Tucson. She had been camped alone near a dry creek bed 40 miles south of Harrow Creek when she made the mistake of examining the seal too closely by firelight. It was not the original seal. The wax had been broken and reapplied. She was certain of it, and that irregularity hooked in her mind like a splinter. What if something had been changed? What if the message she was carrying was not the message that had originally been written? What if she was being used to deliver something that would harm someone who had not deserved to be harmed? She told herself those questions were not her business. She held the letter over the fire and watched the wax soften just slightly at the edge of the seal, and then she told herself she was simply checking the integrity of the seal, which was a lie she believed for approximately 30 seconds before she opened the letter and read it in its entirety by the light of the dying fire. What was in the letter changed everything. It was from a man named Beaumont, a business associate of Crane's in Tucson, and it was addressed to a third party whose name was not written in the letter itself. It described a land acquisition scheme involving fraudulent surveys and forged county records that had been slowly engineered over 2 years. The land in question was the Ellsworth Ranch and the surrounding 3,000 acres of grazing land in the hill country north of Harrow Creek. The scheme had been constructed to collapse at a specific moment, at which point a series of documents would be filed in the county seat that would legally transfer the title of that land to a holding company controlled by Crane's associates. But the letter described something more than a land scheme. It described an arrangement with certain local officials, and it described a specific contingency. If Emmett Ellsworth proved resistant to the legal maneuver, there was a secondary plan involving false charges and a bought judge that would place him in a position to either accept the land transfer or face criminal prosecution for a crime he had not committed. The warning Ida had been paid to deliver was not, as she had believed, a simple message of threat or intimidation. It was the activation signal for the trap. Once she delivered it, Ellsworth would be forced to respond in exactly the way the letter predicted he would respond, and that response would be the legal trigger for the trap to close. She was not the messenger. She was the mechanism. She had resealed the letter with trembling hands and lain awake the rest of the night staring at the stars, and by morning she had made a decision that she knew would cost her something significant. She would still ride to the Ellsworth Ranch. She would still deliver the warning, but she would tell him what was in the letter. The problem, as she had not fully considered until Emmett was holding the letter up by the light of his lantern, was that someone had apparently anticipated exactly this. The letter had been moved from her coat to under her saddle blanket. Someone had searched her. Someone had known she might betray the operation. And Emmett Ellsworth, standing in his doorway with that particular stillness about him, had known her name before she gave it to him. "How long have you known about me?" she asked, once she was sitting in a plain wooden chair inside his kitchen, with a cup of coffee she had not asked for and did not particularly want sitting in front of her on the table. Emmett set the lantern down and sat across from her. He was 31, she would learn later, though in the lamplight he looked like a man who had earned every year of it. He had the build of someone who worked land rather than rode it for show, broad through the shoulders with hands that showed the particular roughness of honest physical labor. His dark hair needed cutting, and there was a line of old scar tissue along his left jaw that she would later learn came from a barbed wire incident at 17. He wore no gun inside his own house, which she noted with some interest. "About 3 weeks," he said. "One of Crane's men has a loose tongue when he's had enough whiskey. I have a friend who works the bar in town." He wrapped both hands around his own coffee cup. "I knew someone would be coming. I didn't know it would be a woman traveling alone." "Did you also know that the warning was a trap?" "I knew the warning was part of something larger," he said. "I didn't know the mechanics of it until you brought that letter." He paused. "The letter you weren't supposed to read." "I was trying to protect you," she said, and then felt immediately foolish for saying it because it was the truth and the truth sounded naive. He looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, with a quality of attention she was not accustomed to receiving, like someone cataloging a complicated thing carefully. "I know," he said. "That's why you're sitting in my kitchen instead of out on the road." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and tried to think clearly. "What happens now?" "That depends," he said, "on what you're willing to do next." The plan Emmett described over the next hour was not the plan of a man who had been caught off guard. He had been building a response to Crane's operation for 3 weeks, quietly and methodically, in the same way that she imagined he did most things. He had a county surveyor in Kerrville who was willing to submit counter-documentation. He had a lawyer in San Antonio, a man named Douglas Ferris, who had made a study of the fraudulent land claim schemes proliferating across the hill country in the early 1880s, and who believed the Ellsworth case was the clearest instance of documented fraud he had encountered. He had affidavits from 3 neighboring ranchers whose own properties had been subject to similar pressure from Crane's associates. What he did not have was the original evidence of the scheme. He had testimony and circumstantial documentation, but not the internal correspondence that would demonstrate the intentional and coordinated nature of the fraud. "The letter from Beaumont," Ida said. "The letter from Beaumont," he confirmed. He looked at her steadily. "You're the only person who can testify to having read it, to its contents, to the fact that it arrived via Crane's courier network." "I'm the only person Crane's people will be watching," she said. "Yes." She let that settle. The kitchen was quiet around them. It was close to midnight by then, the kind of deep stillness that falls over the Texas hill country in early autumn when the insects have gone quiet and the wind has died. A clock ticked somewhere in the house. Ida looked at the letter lying on the table between them. "If I testify," she said, "Crane will know I betrayed him. His men will come for me." "Yes," Emmett said again. He did not dress it up. "And my father's debts, what do you owe him?" She told him the figure. Emmett was quiet for a moment. "I can't promise you that's resolved overnight," he said. "But Ferris has had some success in cases where the debt instrument itself was constructed fraudulently. If Crane built the debt specifically to leverage you into service, that might constitute a coerced arrangement." "Might," she said. "Might," he agreed. She looked at her coffee. It had gone cold, and she drank it anyway, because it gave her something to do with her hands. She was 27 years old, and she had been riding alone across rough country for 7 months in service of a man who had been using her as a tool in a scheme that could have sent an innocent man to prison. And she was sitting in a stranger's kitchen, in the middle of the night being offered something that was not quite salvation and not quite certainty, but was possibly the closest thing to either that was currently available. "Tell me about this ranch," she said. He looked mildly surprised by the change of direction, but he answered. He told her about the 3,000 acres of cedar and limestone hill country that his father had homesteaded in 1858, the years his family had spent building the place from raw land into something viable. He told her about the cattle operation, about the seasonal hands he hired for roundup, about the creek that ran reliable through the summer, about the particular quality of the light in the morning when it came over the eastern ridge and turned the limestone pink. He talked about it the way she imagined you talk about something you have loved your whole life without ever quite needing to articulate the love, just assuming it as permanent as stone. "You grew up here," she said. "Born here," he said. "My father died here. My mother lives in Kerrville now. She doesn't like the isolation anymore, but she visits." He paused. "I'm not going to give this land to Victor Crane." The flatness with which he said it was not drama. It was simply fact, and something in the simplicity of it moved Ida in a way she did not examine too closely just then. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need me to do." What followed was the most complicated 3 weeks of Ida Cooper's life, and that was saying something given the 7 months that had preceded them. She could not simply ride back out of Harrow Creek. Crane's people would be watching the roads, tracking her return, waiting for confirmation that the warning had been delivered and the trap was set. She needed to appear to have done her job. That meant staying in the area, moving carefully, and maintaining the appearance that everything had gone according to plan. Emmett's solution was both practical, and she admitted to herself in the privacy of the small bedroom he gave her on the second floor of the ranch house, unexpectedly considerate. He suggested she present herself in Harrow Creek as a traveler seeking temporary work, which was common enough in the region in the early 1880s, when the population was shifting and strangers were not automatically suspicious. He knew the owner of the dry goods store, a widow named Marguerite Hollies, who needed occasional help and was discreet by temperament. Ida could work for Marguerite Hollies 3 days a week, move freely through town without attracting attention, and use those movements to observe which local officials were in contact with Crane's men. Emmett needed to know who had been bought and who was still honest before he could safely file his counter-documentation with the county. It was intelligent. It was workable. It also meant that Ida would be sleeping under Emmett Ellsworth's roof, eating at his table, and learning the rhythms of his daily life in a proximity that was, in 1883 Texas, slightly beyond the boundaries of strict propriety. He acknowledged this with a characteristic directness she was already beginning to recognize as native to him. "My hired man, Cal Briggs, lives in the bunkhouse," he said, "and I have no interest in your discomfort. If you prefer to board in town, that's your choice. But I think you'll be safer here." She appreciated that he said it plainly and left the decision to her. "I'll stay here," she said. "I appreciate the consideration." The first week passed in a careful, watchful tension that was not entirely unpleasant. Ida rode into Harrow Creek on the first morning and presented herself to Marguerite Hollies as a woman passing through who needed some weeks of work before moving on. Marguerite was 53, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular pragmatism of a woman who had built a business in rough country, without a husband for the past 11 years. She looked Ida over for about 8 seconds and then said she could start Monday, and she paid 15 cents an hour. The work itself was familiar enough. Ida had kept her own household and could manage stock, measure goods, write a receipt, and make change without difficulty. Marguerite's store served as the informal center of Harrow Creek's daily commerce and gossip, and within 3 days Ida had a clear picture of the town's social geography. Sheriff Abel Norris was a problem. He was in his mid-50s, red-faced, and received occasional visits from a man called Darnell who wore a town coat that was too fine for the work he claimed to be doing in the area. Darnell came in for supplies on Wednesday and Thursday of that first week, and each time he left, Sheriff Norris took a long lunch. The county land registrar, a thin young man named Phelps, was a different question. He seemed nervous and overworked, and he bought his supplies quickly and kept his eyes down. And on the Thursday of the first week Ida noticed him reading a letter outside the store that made his face go pale before he folded it and put it in his pocket with hands that were not quite steady. She reported all of this to Emmett each evening. They sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and Ida spread a piece of paper between them and made careful notes in her schoolteacher's handwriting, and Emmett listened to everything she said with the quality of attention she was coming to understand as simply how he existed in the world. He listened the way some people look at things, completely and without the restless impatience that characterized most people she had known. "Phelps," he said on that Thursday evening. "What did the letter look like?" Plain envelope, no frank, handwritten address in block letters. He was quiet for a moment. "Phelps is 24 years old," he said. "He took the registrar's job 8 months ago. His predecessor retired suddenly after 30 years without a word to anyone who knew him well." He looked at the notes on the table. "I think Phelps might be frightened rather than bought." "There's a difference," Ida said. "An important one," he agreed. "A frightened man can change sides," she said. He looked at her with a small, genuine smile, the first one she had seen from him, and it rearranged something in her chest that she did not have a ready name for. "That's exactly what I was thinking." On the Friday evening of that first week, Emmett made dinner himself. He was, she discovered with some surprise, a competent cook in the unshowy, practical way of someone who had lived alone long enough to make peace with the necessity. He made a Dutch oven brisket with dried chilies and onions, served with cornbread from a skillet that he had clearly made many times because he did it entirely without measuring. She sat at the kitchen table and watched him move around the small kitchen and thought about the quality of his presence in a space, the way he never seemed to occupy more room than he needed. "You don't have a wife," she said, because she had been wondering and had decided that wondering in silence was less honest than simply asking. "No," he said without apparent discomfort at the question. He was slicing the cornbread with a long knife, his back half turned to her. "I was close to it once, about 4 years ago. She decided she didn't want the isolation." He paused. She was probably right to decide that. "You're not lonely." He turned and set the plate in front of her. "I'm honest about what I am," he said. "This land is what I am. It's also what makes it hard to keep people around." He sat down across from her. "Are you lonely?" The question was returned so naturally that she answered it before she considered whether she ought to. "I've been lonely for a long time," she said. "I think I stopped noticing it somewhere around the 5th month of riding for Crane." She paused. "When you stop noticing loneliness, it either means you've made peace with it or it's gotten so total that you can't measure it anymore. Which is it for you?" She looked at her plate. "I'm not sure yet." He nodded, as if that was a reasonable answer. They ate dinner in a comfortable quiet that Ida recognized, with some mild alarm, as the kind of quiet she had not experienced with another person in a very long time. The second week brought a complication she had not anticipated. One of Crane's couriers, a young man she knew slightly named Tommy Peets, arrived in Harrow Creek on the Tuesday and asked at the general store whether a woman matching Ida's description had passed through recently. Marguerite Hollies, who knew exactly who Ida was and why she was there because Emmett had trusted her with the broad outline of the situation years before, told Tommy Peets that she had not seen anyone of that description and suggested he check with the saloon. Ida watched this from the back of the store through a gap in the shelving, her heart moving fast and her hands entirely still, which was a combination she had learned in 7 months of Crane's service. Tommy Peets left without finding what he was looking for, but his presence meant that Crane was beginning to wonder why the trap had not yet triggered. Emmett had not responded to the warning in any observable way. He had not left the county, had not made any public statements, had not initiated any legal action that would show up in the county records. Crane's people were expecting a reaction, and the absence of reaction was itself becoming suspicious. "We need to move faster," Ida told Emmett that evening. "Ferris is coming from San Antonio by the end of the week," he said. "I got a telegram from him yesterday. He has the counterfiling prepared." "That's not fast enough if Crane sends someone more capable than Tommy Peets." He looked at her steadily. "What do you recommend?" She had thought about this on the ride back from town. "Phelps," she said. "I want to talk to Phelps." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "That's a risk, if he's not frightened but bought and he tells Crane's people." "I know," she said, "but I watched him for 2 weeks. He's frightened. His hands shook when he read that letter. A bought man is more careful than that." "How would you approach him?" "Not in town. I'll find out where he lives and visit him in the evening. I'll tell him enough to give him a choice." She paused. "I know what it feels like to have a choice offered to you when you thought you had none. I think I can give that to him." Emmett looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that she was finding increasingly difficult to look away from. There was something in his expression that went slightly past assessment, and she felt it in the back of her throat like a note of music in an unexpected register. "Be careful," he said. "I have been careful for 7 months," she said. "I'm quite good at it." He almost smiled again. "I know you are." She visited Hiram Phelps at his boarding house on the Wednesday evening, arriving at the back door at 7 o'clock and knocking twice, softly. He answered in his shirt sleeves with a look of naked fear that confirmed everything she had suspected. She spoke to him for 45 minutes, quietly and plainly. And she told him about the letter and the scheme and the fraudulent surveys. And she told him about Douglas Ferris and the counterfiling that was coming. And she told him that the men who had frightened him were going to lose this particular fight because they had made the mistake of underestimating the people they were trying to take things from. She did not promise him safety. She promised him that if he documented what he had been asked to do, and who had asked him, it would be substantially harder for any consequences to fall on him rather than on the people who had constructed the scheme. She told him that testimony from the county registrar, a state-appointed official, would carry a different legal weight than testimony from a ranch hand or a courier or even a lawyer. Hiram Phelps sat with his hands clasped on the table in front of him for a long time after she stopped speaking. He was 24 and he looked it in the worst way, young and scared and carrying something too heavy for his age. "If they find out I talked," he said. "If they find out you talked after Ferris files, you are one voice in a chorus," she said. "If they find out you talked before that, you need to be somewhere else." She paused. "But I don't think they'll find out before. You're not the kind of man who telegraphs his intentions." He looked at her. "How do you know what kind of man I am?" "Because you've been unhappy since August and you haven't told anyone," she said. "That's discretion, that's useful." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "There's a file cabinet in my office. Locked. The instructions that were sent to me are in an envelope in the second drawer." He swallowed. "I was told to follow them and then destroy them after the transfer was complete." "But you kept them," she said. "I kept them," he said. "Can you get me a copy?" "I can write out a transcription of the material instructions," he said. "By hand tonight if necessary." "Tonight," she said, "would be very useful." She left Phelps's boarding house an hour later with 4 pages of handwritten transcription in her coat, and a feeling that was part relief and part a sharp, clean energy she recognized as the sensation of doing something that actually mattered. She rode back to the ranch in the dark and arrived to find the kitchen lamp still burning and Emmett at the table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be the Beaumont letter laid out flat in front of him. He looked up when she came through the door, and she saw something move through his expression that she did not immediately catalog, something that went slightly past relief. "I was about to come looking for you," he said. "I told you not to," she said. She pulled the 4 pages from her coat and laid them on the table. "Phelps kept the written instructions. He transcribed them for me." Emmett looked at the pages for a long moment, then at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "He's scared, but he's decent." She sat down at the table. "We have the Beaumont letter and Phelps's transcription. What does Ferris need beyond that?" "He needs both of us to make depositions. Him in Kerrville, since the county land office falls under Kerrville jurisdiction." He paused. "And he needs to know exactly what you're prepared to testify to and what your exposure is." "My exposure to Crane, you mean?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving through the cedar trees on the south slope of the property. It was a sound she had been hearing for 2 weeks now, and she had already, without fully deciding to, begun to associate it with something like safety. "I'm prepared to testify to everything I know," she said. "The Beaumont letter, my role as courier, the coerced arrangement, all of it." She looked at him directly. "I told you the night I arrived that I came here to protect someone I'd never met. That hasn't changed." Emmett was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than a conversational pause. She noticed that he had not looked away from her. "It occurred to me," he said slowly, "that I haven't thanked you. You don't need to. You rode 3 days alone from a town you were afraid to leave, carrying information that could have gotten you in a great deal of trouble to warn a stranger." He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her. "That's not something that required no acknowledgement. You gave me a place to stay and a plan that might actually work," she said. "That seems like a fair exchange." "It's not a fair exchange," he said, "but I appreciate you saying it." They looked at each other across the table in the lamplight, and the kitchen was warm and the wind moved in the cedars outside. And Ida Cooper thought with sudden clarity that she had not felt this particular quality of presence from another person since she was a child sitting at her father's kitchen table listening to him read to her from the almanac on winter evenings, the feeling of being exactly where one was supposed to be. She looked away first, because the feeling frightened her slightly. "Get some sleep," Emmett said, and his voice was very gentle. "Ferris arrives Friday. We have a great deal of work to do." Douglas Ferris arrived on Friday afternoon on the San Antonio stage. A compact, energetic man of 47, with a briefcase that appeared to contain more paper than was physically credible, and the manner of someone who had spent 20 years being the most useful person in any room he entered. He shook Ida's hand with a firm grip, and looked at her with the frank professional assessment of a man who needed to know precisely what a witness was made of before he put her in front of anyone. "Tell me everything," he said. "Leave nothing out. I need the full picture before I can determine what's usable and what we leave out of the filing." Ida told him everything. She spoke for nearly 2 hours at the kitchen table while Emmett made coffee and Ferris made notes in a rapid, economical shorthand that covered page after page of his legal pad. She described her arrangement with Crane, the nature of the courier operation, the letter from Beaumont, the tampering with the seal, the contents of the letter, the arrival at the Ellsworth ranch, and the subsequent conversations with Phelps. When she was done, Ferris was quiet for a moment, rereading his notes. Then he said, "The Beaumont letter is the core of it, but the Phelps transcription is remarkable. That gives us internal documentation of the scheme from a county official who received instructions directly." He looked at Emmett. "What about the sheriff?" "Norris has been taking money," Emmett said. "I can't prove it yet. Can you identify the specific meetings dates the man named Darnell?" "Ida can," Emmett said, and looked at her. She gave Ferris everything she had observed about the sheriff and the man called Darnell, the timing of the meetings, the description of Darnell, the pattern of the long lunches. Ferris added it to his notes. "I'll file in Kerrville on Monday," he said. "I'll need your depositions, yours and Ida's, before I can do that. I'd suggest we do those here now tonight so that nothing moves without them already being in the packet." He looked at Ida. "Once this is filed, Crane will know within 48 hours. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," she said. "You'll need to be somewhere he can't easily reach you." "She'll be here," Emmett said. He said it quietly, without looking at Ferris, looking at Ida instead. She did not object to this, which told her something she was not quite ready to say out loud. They made their depositions that evening. Ferris stayed the night in the spare room and rode out before dawn on Saturday to avoid being seen, because his presence in Harrow Creek would alert Crane's network that something was moving. Emmett saw him off at the barn in the pre-dawn dark, and Ida stood on the porch and watched the lamplight move toward the road and then disappear into the tree line. The weekend passed in a state of suspended tension that had its own peculiar intimacy. There was nothing to do but wait, and they waited together in the rhythms of the ranch's daily life. Emmett had cattle to check on the eastern pasture, and she rode with him on the Saturday morning, which she had not planned to do and found herself doing anyway when he saddled both horses and did not say explicitly that she was not invited. The eastern pasture was exactly as he had described it the first night. The limestone ridge caught the morning light and turned briefly gold and then pink, and the cattle moved in the low grasses between the cedar trees, and the air smelled of damp rock and autumn sage. She rode beside him without speaking for a long while, and he did not seem to need her to speak. "How many cattle do you run?" she asked eventually. "About 300 head at peak," he said. "Cal manages the daily checking. I do it myself when I can." He paused. "My father used to say that if you didn't look at the animals yourself every day, you'd stop being a rancher and start being a businessman, and businessmen in this country had a way of coming to a bad end. Your father sounds like a man who had opinions." "He had more opinions than most men twice his size," he said, with a warmth in his voice that she found moving. "He would have had an opinion about you." "What kind of opinion?" He looked at her sideways, and the morning light was behind him, and his expression had a quality she was finding increasingly familiar, that combination of directness and something softer underneath it. "He would have said you were the kind of person who could hold things together." he said. He considered that the highest quality in a human being. He didn't mean it in a small way. He meant it in the way of someone who understood that everything comes apart if no one's holding it. She looked at the cattle moving in the morning light and did not say anything for a moment. "That's a generous thing to say," she said finally. "It's an honest one," he said. They rode back to the ranch in the late morning, and she helped him mend a section of fence in the afternoon, handing him the fencing wire and the pliers, and holding the post steady while he drove the staples. And it was the kind of work that required coordination and proximity, and she was aware of his presence beside her with a specificity she was no longer pretending not to notice. In the evening she sat on the porch while he read in the kitchen, and later he came out and stood at the railing looking at the darkening sky, and she watched his profile against the last of the light and thought about the first night she had arrived here, when she had been calculating the distance to the stable and the road away, when she had been certain that this place was a trap. It was a trap, she supposed, just not the one she had been expecting. On the Sunday morning she asked him across the breakfast table, "What are you going to do after this is over?" He looked up from his coffee. "Keep ranching," he said. "You'll stay here." "This is where I am," he said. "This is what I have." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was bright with morning light, and the sound of the birds in the cedar outside the kitchen window was very clear. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't had a future I could plan for in some time." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him considering something with great care, in the way she had come to recognize as characteristic of how he approached everything he took seriously. "You could stay," he said. "If you wanted to." She looked at him. He met her gaze without looking away. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I'm aware of that." She looked down at her coffee cup. Her heart was moving with a somewhat undisciplined energy she associated specifically with this man and had been managing unsuccessfully for approximately 8 days. "Ask me again," she said, "after this is over." He nodded, as if that was exactly the right answer. "All right," he said. Ferris filed the counter-documentation in Careville on Monday, precisely as planned. The packet included the Beaumont letter, Phelps's transcription, the depositions from Emmett and Ida, the affidavits from the neighboring ranchers, and a 40-page legal brief that Ferris had spent 2 years assembling. The filing triggered an immediate review by the district court, which was the mechanism that prevented Crane's people from proceeding with the fraudulent title transfer while the matter was before the court. Crane knew within 24 hours. On Tuesday afternoon, a man arrived at the Ellsworth Ranch gate on a fast horse. He was one of Crane's senior men, a heavy-set individual named Rhodes who had the look of someone who had been sent to deliver a message that was not a polite one. He stopped at the gate and did not come further because Cal Briggs was standing at the barn with a Winchester rifle held in the easy, not quite tamed manner that communicated its meaning very clearly. Rhodes called from the gate in a carrying voice that was designed to be heard at the house. He said that Mr. Crane was prepared to offer a resolution that would satisfy all parties, and that a meeting was proposed for the following day in Harrow Creek. He said that the cooperation of the woman who had been staying on the property would be noted as a sign of goodwill and might affect the terms of the resolution. Ida stood at the front window of the house and listened to this and felt a cold, focused anger that was cleaner and more useful than fear. "Noted as a sign of goodwill," she said. Emmett was standing beside her at the window. "He wants you to withdraw the deposition." "He wants me to be frightened enough to withdraw the deposition," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her sideways. "Tell Rhodes there will be no meeting," she said. "Tell him the matter is before the district court and that all further communication should be directed to Mr. Ferris in San Antonio." Emmett went to the door and delivered this message. Rhodes sat on his horse for a moment after hearing it, then turned and rode away at a deliberate pace that was meant to look unhurried. Emmett came back inside and closed the door. "He'll try something else," Emmett said. "He'll try Phelps," she said. "He's the weakest point in our chain." I sent a telegram to Ferris this morning. He's making arrangements for Phelps to give his sworn testimony before a notary today or tomorrow, not just the written transcription. Once it's sworn, withdrawing it is a much more serious legal action. She exhaled. You're 2 steps ahead of them. I've been living with this threat for 3 weeks longer than they know, he said. On the Wednesday, 3 things happened in rapid succession. Ferris sent a telegram confirming that Phelps had given sworn testimony, and that the district court had issued a temporary injunction, halting any land title proceedings related to the affected property. Sheriff Norris was observed by 2 independent witnesses accepting a cash payment from the man called Darnell behind the Harrow Creek livery, which observation was written down and signed and transmitted to Ferris that same day. And a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Ida Cooper in a handwriting she recognized as Victor Crane's. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the letter while Emmett stood at the window, deliberately not reading over her shoulder, which she appreciated. Crane's letter was not threatening in any language she could point to. It was the language of a very careful, very controlled man who knew the walls were closing and was looking for a pressure point. It spoke of her father's debts. It spoke of the remaining obligation on the family land. It spoke of certain obligations that would become due if the arrangement between himself and Ida Cooper was considered to have been broken by one party. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table. He's going to go after my father's land, she said. Emmett turned from the window. The debt instruments. He holds them. She looked at the letter. This is the part I didn't fully account for. He crossed the room and sat across from her and read the letter without touching it, reading down the page once, then looking at her. I told you Ferris has looked at cases where the debt was constructed as a coercion tool, he said. That takes time. Legal processes take time. My father's land could be taken before the court resolves Ferris's challenge. Not if I buy the debt, Emmett said. She looked at him. He said it as simply as if he were suggesting a different route across the county. If I purchase the debt instruments from Crane before he can foreclose, your father's obligation transfers to me. I have no intention of calling it. It simply ceases to be a weapon he can use against you. She felt something shift in her chest, large and warm and somewhat overwhelming. That is a significant amount of money, she said. I know what it is. Emmett, you came here to protect me, he said. You put yourself at considerable risk to do that. You have been doing it for 3 weeks. His voice was very steady and very quiet. Let me do this. She looked at him across the table in the morning light, and the feeling she had been managing unsuccessfully for 8 days was no longer manageable. Why? She said, and her voice was slightly unsteady. He looked at her with the full quality of that gray-eyed attention and said simply, because I don't want you carrying this alone anymore. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of another person in a very long time. But the back of her throat ached with it, and she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed carefully until the sensation was manageable. All right, she said. He went to Harrow Creek that afternoon. She stayed at the ranch and helped Cal mend a section of the north fence and tried not to think too much about what was happening in town. When Emmett came back in the early evening, he put a folded paper on the kitchen table without comment. It was a bill of sale for the debt instruments, signed by Crane's local agent, who had apparently been persuaded to sell without referring the matter to Crane himself, which Emmett attributed to the fact that the agent was a pragmatic man who had read the district court injunction very carefully and understood which direction the legal wind was blowing. He'll be furious, she said. Yes, Emmett agreed. But the instruments are mine now. Your father's land is safe. She folded the paper very carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and then stood in the kitchen with her back to him for a moment, collecting herself. Thank you, she said, when she turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she had no adequate description for, tender and serious and entirely without pretense. You're welcome, he said. The case moved through the district court over the following 6 weeks, which Ida spent at the Ellsworth Ranch and in the town of Harrow Creek, and the 6 weeks had a quality that she understood later as the sensation of a life rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. Ferris was a thorough and aggressive advocate. The fraudulent survey documentation was dismantled methodically in the legal filing, with comparisons to official territorial survey records demonstrating the discrepancies. The Beaumont letter, authenticated by a handwriting examiner Ferris brought from Austin, established the intentional and coordinated nature of the scheme. Phelps's sworn testimony provided the operational detail from inside the county system. The depositions from the neighboring ranchers established the pattern of targeting. Victor Crane did not attend any of the proceedings. He sent lawyers from San Antonio and Houston, capable men who did what they could with the material available to them, which was not very much given the quality of the documentation against them. The temporary injunction was converted to a permanent one in the 5th week. The fraudulent land title proceedings were voided by the district court. The county records were ordered corrected. Sheriff Norris was quietly removed from his position pending a separate investigation into the accepted payments. He left Harrow Creek before the investigation concluded and was not seen in the county again. Crane himself was never prosecuted. The evidence against him was circumstantial enough that a criminal charge was not viable, which was a particular kind of injustice that Ferris acknowledged plainly and without false comfort. Crane was a man who had constructed his operations carefully and left himself several steps removed from the actionable elements. He lost the land scheme. He lost his local network. He lost the leverage he had built over Ida and a number of other people in the region. But he was not in a prison cell, and the fact of that sat in Ida like a stone for a while. Emmett acknowledged this one evening when they were sitting on the porch in the October dusk, the air carrying the first real edge of autumn coolness. He said it quietly without trying to soften it. He gets to walk away. Yes, she said. That's a wrong that doesn't get fully righted. No, she said, it doesn't. She looked at the darkening sky over the eastern ridge. But your land is yours. Phelps is free of them. My father's land is safe. She paused. Sometimes you only get some of what justice looks like. He was quiet beside her. Then he said, Ferris told me there are other cases, other counties, other victims of the same scheme. He's building toward a larger action. It might take years. I know, she said. He told me too. She paused. He asked if I'd be willing to testify again if the larger case comes together. What did you say? I said yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good. The ease of that one word, the simple acknowledgement without question or condition, landed in her like a stone dropped in still water. On a cool Friday evening in the 3rd week of October, 1883, Emmett Ellsworth said something to Ida Cooper that she had been waiting, without allowing herself to fully acknowledge the waiting, since the morning at the breakfast table when he had said, ask me again after this is over. They were walking back from the eastern pasture in the late afternoon light, the horses moving slowly on the loose reins, the limestone ridge burning its brief gold in the last of the sun. He had not planned this, she thought. He was not a man who planned declarations. He simply said what was true when it was true. I meant it, he said, when I said you could stay. She looked at him sideways. I know you meant it. I want to be more specific than that now, he said, if you'll let me. Her heart was very loud inside her. I'm listening, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking straight ahead at the trail. I've been in this house alone for a long time, he said. Not unhappily, I know how to be alone, but the past 6 weeks have been. He stopped, searching for the right word in his characteristic unhurried way. Different, he said, in a way that I don't want to go back from. He turned and looked at her directly. You came here carrying a warning that was meant to be a trap, and you turned it into something else entirely, and the something else you turned it into is the thing I want to be part of for the rest of my life. He paused. I'm not a man who does things by half, so I'll say the whole of it. I love you, Ida. I'd like you to stay here and build this life with me if that's something you want. The horses walked on slowly in the fading light. The cedar trees moved gently in the late afternoon wind. Ida looked at the man riding beside her, at the profile she had spent 6 weeks learning. the slight scar on his jaw and the dark hair that still needed cutting and the quality of quiet that was native to him. And she thought about the schoolteacher she had been in Millbridge, the sensible life she had been living, the 7 months of riding alone across rough country carrying other people's intentions. And the morning she had arrived at this gate with a warning dying on her lips and the feeling that the trap had already closed. She thought about what it meant that the trap had turned out to be this. "I love you too," she said. "I think I've known it for some time and been waiting for the appropriate moment to say it." He looked at her, and the smile that crossed his face was full and unhurried and completely real, and it was the best thing she had seen in a very long time. "Is this an appropriate moment?" he asked. "It's a very good moment," she said. He reached across and took her hand, which required some management on horseback, but they managed it, and they rode the rest of the way back to the ranch in the fading gold of the afternoon, with their hands linked between the horses and the cedar trees moving in the wind and the limestone ridge going from gold to pink to the deep blue-gray of twilight. And Ida Cooper thought that this was what it felt like when a life chose you as much as you chose it. They were engaged by November, formally and without much ceremony, because Emmett was not a man who believed ceremony needed to precede sincerity. He asked her properly at the kitchen table one morning with a coffee cup in his hand and a directness that made her laugh, and she said yes without needing to think about it. And then he produced a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone, and she held out her hand, and he put it on her finger with a seriousness that moved her deeply. His mother, Emmett Ellsworth, came from Careville for a Sunday visit in mid-November, and Ida was somewhat apprehensive about this meeting, because Emmett was by Emmett's description, a woman of considerable opinions. Emmett turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman of 60 who wore her age with a kind of elegant toughness Ida immediately admired. She looked at Ida for a long moment after the introduction, then looked at her son, then back at Ida. "He told me you rode 3 days alone to warn him about a land scheme," she said. "Yes," Ida said, "and then you stayed and helped him take it apart." "We took it apart together," Ida said. Emmett smiled. It was a smile very much like her son's, full and genuine and unhurried. "I've been waiting for someone like you for quite some time," she said. They were married in December in Harrow Creek, in the small white church that sat on the east side of town across from the dry goods store where Ida had worked for Marguerite Hollies. Marguerite Hollies stood in the front row and wept productively and unself-consciously, which Ida found extremely touching. Cal Briggs, Emmett's hired man, cleaned up remarkably well in a borrowed suit and served as one of the witnesses. Farris came from San Antonio with his wife and stayed 2 nights, which was the most festive the ranch had been in some years. The ceremony was simple. The minister read from the Book of Ruth, which was Ida's choice, because there was a particular verse about "where you go I will go" that felt precisely right to her. Emmett stood beside her in his good suit with the garnet-colored tie she had picked out together with his mother, and when he said "I do," he looked at her with the full weight of everything he meant by it, and she felt the truth of it in every part of herself. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, alone, with the fire burning in the parlor and the December wind moving in the cedar trees, and the night was quiet and warm, and everything between them was honest and glad and entirely right. The winter passed in a state of companionable industry. There were cattle to manage through the colder months, repairs to the south fence line that had been deferred through the autumn, wood to lay in, accounts to review. Emmett taught Ida the operational realities of running 3,000 acres of hill country ranch, not because she had asked, but because he considered it natural that a partner should understand the full scope of what they were working with. She absorbed it with the systematic attention of the teacher she had been, asking questions until she understood the answers fully, and Emmett answered every question with the patient thoroughness she had come to understand was simply how he loved. She wrote to her father in January. Her father was a man named Robert Cooper who lived in Millbridge, and who had, for most of Ida's adult life, been a source of worry rather than support, not cruelly, but through the particular weakness of a man who made poor decisions and expected others to manage the consequences. She wrote to him carefully and fully, explaining what had happened with Crane and the debts, explaining that the debt instruments were now in Emmett's hands and carried no obligation, and explaining that she was married and happy and hoped he would come to understand that the path forward for their family did not run through men like Victor Crane. Her father wrote back. The letter was not entirely satisfying because Robert Cooper was still Robert Cooper, but it was honest, and it contained an apology she had not been sure she would ever receive. He said he was proud of her, and he said it twice in different words, which told her the pride was real. She wrote back and invited him to visit in the spring. He came in April, Robert Cooper, 70 miles by stage from Millbridge to the Harrow Creek Junction, and then hired a buggy to the ranch. And Emmett met him at the gate with the particular courtesy of a man who understood that this was important to his wife, and intended to do his part accordingly. Robert Cooper was 58, and somewhat diminished from the figure Ida remembered from her childhood, smaller and more careful, with eyes that held the look of a man who had been carrying shame long enough to have incorporated it into his daily posture. The visit was 3 days, and it was not without its difficult moments, because the history between a parent and a child who has paid the parent's debts is never entirely simple. But there were good moments, too. Her father and Emmett sat on the porch in the April evenings and talked about cattle prices and the reliability of certain tools and the qualities of the hill country soil. And her father was at his best in those conversations, the version of himself that had existed before the bad decisions accumulated, the man who had read to her from the almanac on winter evenings. She watched those porch evenings from the kitchen window and felt something resolve in her that had been unresolved for a long time. When her father left on the 4th morning, he shook Emmett's hand with both hands, which was not a gesture he made lightly, and he kissed Ida on the forehead and told her she had found a good life. She agreed with him. In the summer of 1884, Ferris wrote from San Antonio with news that the larger case against Crane's land acquisition network was moving toward a grand jury proceeding in Travis County. 3 other victims of the scheme, from different counties, had come forward. The evidence package, including the Beaumont letter and Ida's testimony from the original Harrow Creek case, was a centerpiece of the filing. He asked if Ida would be willing to come to Austin to give testimony before the grand jury when the time came. She and Emmett discussed it in the evening, sitting on the porch in the warm Texas summer, the fireflies moving in the pasture below the house. "It means 2 weeks in Austin, maybe 3, she said. "I know," he said. "You'd be managing the ranch alone." "Cal will be here," he said, "and I've done it before." He paused. "You should go." "I know I should," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He reached over and took her hand in the dark. "Say yes to Ferris," he said, "and I'll ride to Careville with you before you go, and we'll have dinner at that restaurant my mother likes." She laughed, and the laugh felt full and uncomplicated, which was how most things felt now. "All right," she said. She went to Austin in September of 1884 and gave testimony before the Travis County grand jury for 2 full days, calm and clear and comprehensive. And the grand jury returned an indictment against Victor Crane and 3 of his associates on charges of fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and corrupt interference with public officials. Crane was arrested at his ranch outside San Marcos on a Wednesday morning, which Ferris telegraphed to her at her hotel in Austin, and she sat with the telegram on the bed in her hotel room and felt the stone that had been sitting in her since the day the case closed in Harrow Creek finally, slowly, loosen. She rode home to the ranch 5 days later on a clear September afternoon, and when she came over the last rise before the property gate, she could see the ranch spread out below her in the autumn light, the limestone house and the barn and the cedar-covered hills beyond. and Emmett standing at the gate watching the road, which meant he had been watching the road for some part of the afternoon, and had been watching the road long enough to spot her well before she reached the gate. She rode down to him, and he was there when she arrived, standing at her horse's head and looking up at her with his eyes very clear and warm in the afternoon light. "How did it go?" he said. "Crane is indicted," she said. He was quiet for a moment, taking that in. "Good," he said. She dismounted and he was there, and she came into his arms and he held her for a moment in the quiet afternoon light at the gate to their property, and she could feel his steadiness around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. "Welcome home," he said, against the top of her head. "I missed you considerably," she said. She felt him smile against her hair. "I missed you considerably as well," he said. "We are going to have a very unremarkable autumn, and I am deeply looking forward to it." She laughed. "Define unremarkable." "Cattle, fence repair, you reading on the porch in the evenings," he said. "No legal proceedings, no federal testimony, no Victor Crane." "That sounds perfect," she said. It was perfect. The autumn of 1884 at the Ellsworth Ranch was as peaceful a season as Ida had ever lived through. The days were clear and cool and full of work she had come to love, the tangible, productive work of land and animals, and the small daily decisions that kept a ranch operating through the harder months. She and Emmett worked alongside each other with the easy coordination of two people who had learned each other's habits and preferences, and who had stopped performing their best selves for each other and simply were themselves, which was its own extraordinary thing. She had gone back to teaching in a small way. There were 5 children on the neighboring ranches who were of school age but too far from Harrow Creek to attend school regularly, and she had established a twice-weekly arrangement with their parents to come to the Ellsworth Ranch and conduct lessons in the front room. She taught reading and arithmetic and some natural history, and the children were various degrees of enthusiastic about various parts of it, and she found that she had not lost the fundamental satisfaction of teaching, the particular pleasure of watching a child's face when something clicks into understanding. Emmett had observed one of these sessions from the kitchen doorway early in the arrangement, and she had noticed him watching and raised an eyebrow at him, and he had smiled and gone back to whatever he had been doing. But at dinner that evening, he had told her that she was very good at it, with the specific weight of a man who does not say things for politeness alone. "I know," she said. "I was always good at it, I just lost access to it for a while." "You have it back now," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do." In the December of 1884, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Ida told Emmett she was pregnant. She told him in the morning before breakfast because she had been carrying the knowledge for 3 days and it had become impossible to carry alone. She said it plainly and directly because that was how she did things now, and he was very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression she had no adequate words for and kissed her forehead. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "A little," he said, "and entirely happy." "Yes," she said, "exactly that." She wrote to Emmett Ellsworth in Careville and to her father in Millbridge, both on the same afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table in the December light. Her father wrote back within the week, a letter that was the warmest he had written her in years, full of the remembered language of her childhood. Emmett Ellsworth came from Careville on a Sunday and sat in the kitchen, and was practical and loving and full of useful information about what to expect and who in Careville was the best physician, and who was the best midwife, and what supplies should be obtained before spring. The pregnancy proceeded without significant drama. Ida was well and energetic through the winter and early spring, managing the teaching sessions and the ranch accounts and the house, and Emmett managed the worry that he managed in his characteristically quiet way, which meant she found the kitchen always warm when she came downstairs, and there was always enough of whatever she needed, and he never said anything overprotective, but always seemed to be available when she was carrying something heavy. The summer of 1885 was warm and long. Ida's body grew round and heavy, with the particular dignity of a woman who has decided to be present in her physical reality rather than apologetic about it. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the fireflies in the pasture and felt the child move inside her with the strange, interior quality of new life. And Emmett sat beside her, and she sometimes put his hand on her side so he could feel it too. And his face in those moments was very open and young in a way she treasured. Their son was born in August of 1885, delivered by the midwife from Careville with Emmett present in the house and a leaner in the kitchen, and the whole ranch held in a particular quality of suspended breath that resolved, in the early morning hours, into a sound that was the best sound either of them had ever heard. They named him Robert James Ellsworth, Robert for her father, James for Emmett's father who had built the ranch and died before he could know this would happen here. Emmett held him in the first light of the morning and looked at him with an expression of complete wonder that Ida watched from the bed where she was tired and aching and profoundly content. And she thought that she had arrived at this ranch carrying a warning and had been asked to stay for the aftermath. And the aftermath had turned out to contain a great deal more than she had been in any position to imagine on that September night in 1883. Cal Briggs, when informed, removed his hat and held it to his chest for a full minute before saying gruffly that it was about time there were children on this property. Emmett Ellsworth held her grandson and wept without embarrassment and told him in a steady voice that he had come into an extraordinary family, which Ida thought was both true and generous. Robert Cooper came from Millbridge when he received the telegram, riding the stage to Careville and hiring a horse for the last stretch, and arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday with a carved wooden horse he had made himself, smooth and clearly worked with care. He held his grandson with the slightly frightened tenderness of a man not accustomed to babies, and the baby looked at him with the profound, unimpressed dignity of all new persons. And after a while, Robert Cooper began to relax and talk to the baby in the language he had used when Ida was small, the soft, comfortable language of someone reading from an almanac on a winter evening. And Ida watched this from across the room and felt the last residue of old grief quietly dissolve. The years following were years of building. The ranch prospered through the mid-1880s as the cattle market held steady and Emmett's careful management of the land, and the herd maintained the operational quality his father had established. Cal Briggs stayed on and trained two younger hands who came in 1886. Ferris won his case against Crane and his associates in Travis County in the autumn of 1885. Crane was convicted of fraud and conspiracy and received a 7-year sentence, which was less than Ferris had hoped for but more than Crane had clearly expected, and it was enough. Ida's testimony was noted in the Austin newspaper as unusually clear and compelling. She did not read the newspaper coverage, but Ferris sent her the relevant clipping, which she put in the small wooden box where she kept the important papers. The garnet ring her mother-in-law had given her was in that box too, on the nights she didn't wear it, which were rare. The teaching arrangement with the neighboring ranch's children expanded in 1886, when 2 more families arrived in the area with children of school age. She now had 9 students, which required more formal organization, and she converted the unused back room of the ranch house into a proper classroom space with a proper blackboard and the requisite primers and slates. Emmett built the desks himself over a winter, which took longer than it might have because he was also managing the ranch through a dry season, but he finished them before spring, and she ran her hands over the smooth wood of the surfaces and thought about the quality of his attention, the way he built things to last. She had been writing too, quietly and without calling it anything in particular, a record of the events of 1883 and what had preceded and followed them. She had no clear intention for the writing at first. It had simply begun as the schoolteacher's habit of putting experience into clear language. But the record grew through 1885 and 1886 into something more considered, a document of a particular kind of injustice and resistance and consequence, with the specificity of someone who had been inside it. Ferris, when she showed it to him on one of his visits, was quiet for a long time after reading. "This is important," he said. "It's a personal record," she said. "It's a record of how these schemes worked," he said. "How they found leverage. How they used ordinary people as instruments. There are more cases like ours. There will continue to be more." He looked at her. "This should be read by people who can use it." She thought about this for some months. Eventually, she sent a version of it to a law professor at the University of Texas in Austin whom Ferris knew, and the professor wrote back with considerable interest and a number of specific questions. The correspondence continued for some time, and the document was eventually reproduced in a form useful to legal practitioners working on similar cases in other Texas counties and in New Mexico territory. She told Emmett about this over dinner on an evening in late 1887, somewhat diffidently, because she was not sure how he would feel about the details of their particular history being shared in this broader way. He looked at her across the table with the steadiness she knew entirely now, the quality of a man who was entirely present when it mattered. "You turned a trap into a defense for other people," he said. She looked at her plate. "Something like that." "That's not something," he said. "That's exactly what it is." Their second child, a daughter, was born in 1888. She came into the world in the spring, in the same way her brother had, with the midwife from Careville and a leaner in the kitchen, and the particular suspended quality of the ranch in the hours before dawn. They named her Clara May Ellsworth, Clara for Emmett's grandmother whose photograph hung in the front hall, May for the month of spring and new things. Robert James Ellsworth, who was 3 years old and deeply uncertain about the arrival of another person into his household, adjusted over the course of approximately 2 weeks, and thereafter appointed himself the primary supervisor of his sister's activities, which created a dynamic of protective interference that Ida recognized with some amusement as fundamentally similar to the dynamic between herself and the 7 months of Crane's operation. Some people were simply constitutionally inclined to be watchful over the things they cared about. The ranch at the end of the 1880s had the quality of something fully realized. The limestone house had been expanded by another room in 1886, and the porch had been rebuilt and extended to wrap around the south side, giving them shade in the afternoon and a view of the creek through the cedar trees. The classroom in the back was noisy on lesson days and quiet on weekends, and always smelled slightly of chalk. The kitchen was where most of the real business of the household was conducted, accounts and correspondence, and the small daily decisions, and the dinners that were always a center of warmth. Emmett was in his late 30s by then, and the years of the land showed in him in the good ways, a deepened steadiness, a quality of ease in his own dimensions that comes only with time and work, and the satisfaction of having built something that holds. He still rode the eastern pasture in the early morning, checking on the cattle himself when he could, and she sometimes rode with him when both children were in a leaner's care for a Sunday, which a leaner arranged with the deliberate generosity of a woman who understood what a marriage needed to stay itself. On one of those Sunday mornings in the autumn of 1889, 6 years after the September night when Ida had arrived at his gate with a warning on her lips, they were riding along the limestone ridge in the early light, the air cold and clear with the smell of juniper and coming winter, and Emmett said something that she kept with her for the rest of her life. He said, "I think about the night you arrived sometimes." "What do you think about it?" she asked. "I think about what I would have done if you hadn't read the letter," he said. "If you delivered the warning as given and ridden away." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ridge. "I had the counterfiling ready. I had some of the protection in place. But the Beaumont letter was the piece I didn't have, and without it, Crane's lawyers might have managed to muddy the evidence enough that the outcome was uncertain." He paused. "And you would have ridden away and I would never have known what you'd done." She thought about this. The sun was coming over the ridge and turning the limestone the brief warm gold she had been watching for 6 autumns. "I didn't read the letter because I was planning to save you," she said. "I read it because I was frightened about what I was carrying and I needed to know." "I know," he said. "That's the part that stays with me. You made an honest decision for an honest reason and it changed everything." He looked at her. "And then you stayed." "You asked me to stay," she said. "After you delivered the warning," he said. "You came here to deliver a warning and I asked you to stay for the aftermath." He smiled slightly. "The aftermath has been considerable." She looked at him in the morning light, this man who had been a stranger in a doorway on a September night with a letter she recognized and eyes that had looked at her as if they already knew what she was. And she thought about all the ways a life could go and how few of them she would have chosen over this one. "The aftermath has been the whole of it," she said. "The warning was the beginning. Everything after was the life." He reached over and took her hand, as he had on the day they rode back from the eastern pasture in the first year, and he had said what he meant clearly and without pretense. And she held his hand in the cold autumn morning, with the cedars moving on the hillside and the sound of the cattle below, and the smoke beginning to rise from the ranch house, where a leaner was managing their children with cheerful efficiency. And she thought that this was what it meant to have been found by the life you were supposed to have. They rode back in the rising warmth of the morning, and the ranch received them at the gate as it always did, as if it had been waiting, as if they belonged to it as much as it belonged to them. And Ida Cooper Ellsworth, who had once been a school teacher in a town called Millbridge, and then a courier for a man named Crane, and then a woman who had ridden 3 days alone to warn a stranger of a trap, came home to the kitchen and the sound of her children, and the smell of the coffee that her mother-in-law had left on the stove, and she took off her riding coat and hung it on the peg beside the door and picked up her daughter, who reached for her with both arms the way children do when they are entirely certain they are loved, and held her close in the warm kitchen light. Emmett came in behind her and closed the door against the autumn morning, and looked at the kitchen and the children and his mother and his wife in the way. He looked at all the things he valued, completely and without reserve. And Ida looked back at him over the top of their daughter's dark head. And what passed between them in that look was the whole history of the past 6 years and the whole future of every year after, and it was more than enough. It was more than enough for both of them, for all their lives. Victor Crane served 5 years of his sentence and was released in 1890 under conditions Ferris considered insufficient, but accepted as the reality of the available legal instruments. He was a diminished man by then, the methodical patience stripped from him by the prison years, and he did not return to his previous activities in any coordinated way. He died in 1894 in San Marcos, of a cardiac condition, without resolution or repentance that anyone recorded. Ferris wrote to Ida when it happened, a brief and measured note that acknowledged the inadequacy of the ending without pretending it was other than it was. She wrote back to Ferris and thanked him for the note, and for the 6 years of work he had put into cases like hers. Then she folded the letter and put it in the cedar box with the other papers of consequence, the bill of sale for the debt instruments and the wedding certificate and the first letter her father had sent after she told him she was married. And she closed the box and set it back on the shelf and went back to the living day. In 1891, the school in Harrow Creek expanded to a full building, and the school board, composed now of ranchers and business owners who had watched the informal sessions Ida had been running from the back room of the Ellsworth Ranch for 5 years, voted to hire a permanent teacher for the growing student population. They asked Ida first. She declined, because she was managing the ranch accounts and the classroom and her own family, and had found the scale of the work she was doing already right-sized to the life she wanted. But she helped recruit the teacher, a young woman from a teacher's college in San Antonio named Frances Webb, who arrived in Harrow Creek in September of 1891, with a trunk full of books and the particular energy of someone beginning the right vocation. And Ida mentored her through the first year with the satisfaction of passing something forward. Cal Briggs married the following spring, a woman named Dorothy who had come to Harrow Creek with her brother to help run his small farm. The wedding was in May and the reception was at the Ellsworth Ranch, which had by then hosted enough community gatherings to have a natural ease about it. And Emmett barbecued a side of beef over a fire that Cal helped him build and maintain. And it was an excellent afternoon of food and music from a fiddle player from town, and the particular quality of a gathered community that knows it is a community. Robert James Ellsworth, 6 years old, ate 2 pieces of cake and fell asleep under the porch table, which Ida discovered when she nearly tripped over him in the evening. She picked him up and he barely woke, just rearranged himself against her shoulder with the complete trust of the deeply sleeping, and she carried him upstairs to his room with the fiddle music floating up from the yard below and the summer night warm around her, and set him down gently in his bed. Emmett was in the doorway when she turned around, watching her. He had come up from the yard without her hearing, which was typical of him, and his expression was the one she loved most in him, the full, unhurried, entirely real one. She went to him in the doorway and he put his arm around her and they stood for a moment in the hall listening to the music from below and the sound of their daughter sleeping in her room across the hall. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. "There are more coming," he said. She leaned against him in the warm hall of the house his father had built and smiled at the ceiling. "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." And she was right. There were more coming, year after year, building on each other in the way that good lives do, each one different and each one adding to the whole in ways that were not always dramatic but were always true, the texture of a life fully and honestly lived in a particular place with a particular person, and none of it was perfect and all of it was hers. The land held. The ranch held. The family held. And Ida Cooper Ellsworth, who had once been sent to deliver a warning, kept the life that she had been asked to stay for, and found it, every single year, worth every mile of the road that had brought her to it.